Happy New Day. I hope you're doing well. Yeah, I know it looks awful, but I decided that this would be fun. Don't you agree? I'm still kind of in the middle of that huge identity crisis that I talked at length about in the last part, but I'm more acclimated to it. I mean, that's how everyone deals with trauma, right? Acclimating? What's it called? I wouldn't go so far as to call it trauma. I'm just a confused person. Which is fine, as long as you seek the answers. Oh yeah, I did look up all of the things that I needed to look up. Missa Solemnis is just another way of saying solemn mass, and it was also a composition by Beethoven. Yes, and I look forward to listening to it later. Dim can mean dimensionally or demedius, which means a half of which. I forget what that was related to. Quod vide means as you wish or as you see. Urolagnia is sexual pleasure from urination. Sabazios, or also known as Sabadio, was a progenitor god that filled a similar role of godhead as Zeus did. And their most famous relic, which is very fun, is called the Hand of Sabadios. It's a ritual gauntlet, and it's covered with all kinds of funky symbology. Like in the palm of the hand or like around the wrist, there's a hearth with woman and child. It's very sweet. They've got a whole bunch of animals, oh, wrong one, whole bunch of animals around the side. Sorry, I just tell people that I love them so much, so it's natural. Although the Latin sign of benediction, I didn't know this was a thing. I'm gonna have to stick to that. The Syriac Behelit and Beherit, it's a rock band, but also it's just another name for Satan. I forget the specific etymological details. What it means to fillip is this kind of motion, a flick. And it can also mean to bolster something, give a fillip to my attitude, or this really filliped me up. Hearing the good news about the storm, which has actually been rather disappointing. Teutonites were a group of crusaders. They specifically focused on being healers and medics to the other wounded warriors. And if you think of like stereotypical paladin armor, that was them. The leader of the Teutonites had the big old wings on his helmet. Everyone else had the blocky, hard metal plate armor over their faces, all white, black cross. There we go. And Mephistopheles, it seems like he actually originated in the Tale of Faust. Yep, I think that was everything. My goal today is to flip and finish this Book of Lucifer and finally move on to the next part. Let's see, right now we are on the choice of human sacrifice. And next on the list is oh yeah, we've only got like 4 chapters left. In my average like 2-hour video, that's what I'm able to accomplish. The last 2 were outliers. I'm quite thirsty and quite hungry, but things kept getting in the way and I didn't want to eat and ruin my makeup until afterwards. I'm considering getting rid of my mustache so that I can wear lipstick more often, but if it's going to get ruined every single time I eat something, I don't know. Yeah, it's starting to come off, but not that bad. All right. The supposed purpose in performing the ritual of sacrifice is to throw the energy provided by the blood of the freshly slaughtered victim into the atmosphere of the magical working, thereby intensifying the magician's chances of success. The white magician assumes that since blood represents the life force, there is no better way to appease the gods or demons than to present them with suitable quantities of it. Combine this rationale with the fact that a dying creature is expending an overabundance of adrenal and other biochemical energies, and you have what appears to be an unbeatable combination. The white magician, wary of the consequences involved in the killing of a human being, naturally utilizes birds or other lower creatures in his ceremonies. It seems that these sanctimonious wretches feel no guilt in taking of a non-human life, as opposed to a human's. I agree, although I doubt that Mr. Dr. LeVay was a vegan. Although I should say a moral failing on my part is that I did not check to see whether or not this eyeshadow and lipstick were non-animal tested. I know that the products themselves are vegan, no animals used in their creation, but... The fact of the matter is that if the magician is worthy of his name, he will be uninhibited enough to release the necessary force from his own body, instead of from an unwilling and undeserving victim. Contrary to all established magical theory, the release of this force is not effected in the actual spilling of blood, but in the death throes of the living creature. This discharge of bioelectrical energy is the very same phenomenon which occurs during any profound heightening of the emotions, such as sexual orgasm, blind anger, mortal terror, consuming grief, etc. Of these emotions, the easiest entered into of one's own volition are sexual orgasm and anger, with grief running a close third. Remembering that the two most readily available of these three, sexual orgasm and anger, have been burned into man's unconscious as sinful by religionists, it is small wonder they are shunned by the white magician, who plods along carrying the greatest of all millstones of guilt. I'm sorry, but guilt in religion, speaking to Catholicism, pardon me, it's a major thing. Everybody talks about the Catholic guilt, A, and B, God is described over and over again as being wrathful and jealous and cruel, in his own words, nonetheless. Expunge wrath on thine enemies. I don't know. I don't want to get out my Bible. It's up there somewhere. And also, I do agree about... Well, there's more to it than that. It's... If you were specifically looking to summon a creature that exists on that realm, then providing them with flesh to manifest themselves is important. And it's true that great magicians don't require sacrifices of this nature, but it's a polite thing to do if you're summoning. And also, if you're not that great of a magician, then you just need to pay a higher toll in terms of sacrifice. No harm. The inhibitive and asinine absurdity in the need to kill an innocent living creature at the high point of a ritual, as practiced by erstwhile wizards, is obviously their lesser of the evils. When a discharge of energy is called for, these poor, conscience-stricken fools, who have been calling themselves witches and warlocks, would sooner chop off the head of a goat or chicken in an attempt to harness its death agony than to have the blasphemous bravery to masturbate in the full view of Jehovah, whom they claim to deny. The only way that these mystical cowards can ritualistically release themselves is through the agony of another's death, actually their own by proxy, rather than the indulgent force which produces life. The treaders of the path of white light are truly the cold and the dead. No wonder these tittering pustules of mystic wisdom must stand within the protective circles and bind the evil forces in order to keep themselves safe from attack. One good orgasm would probably kill them. Dr. LeVay has such a sense of humor. Well, in terms of relating to the nature of the universe and spiritual transcendence, then absolutely, orgasmic power is important. Um, Tantric sex is a tradition that's been carried out in both Western and Eastern traditions, although Catholicism did nip that in the bud, I'm pretty sure. I'm sure I've already told the story of how ziggurats were used in Babylonian practices, and I say Babylonian practices, but really Mesopotamian, prehistoric ritual in general. Beautiful. Went by too fast. We're remodeling the kitchen, and it's a miracle that I managed to keep this in its state while we were remodeling the kitchen. But also, my tea is lukewarm. Not too much fun. I will say that my first encounter with God, I did. It was a sexual encounter. It's kind of awkward. The woman that I loved at the time was sitting just a few feet away from me. Oh, glorious. Well, I shouldn't say my first encounter with God. They're everywhere, but my first time being aware of their presence. Anyway, the use of a human sacrifice in a satanic ritual does not imply that the sacrifice is slaughtered to appease the gods. Symbolically, the victim is destroyed through the working of a hex or curse, which in turn leads to the physical, mental, or emotional destruction of the sacrifice, in ways and means not attributable to the magician. Excuse me. The use of a human sacrifice in a satanic ritual does not imply the sacrifice is slaughtered to appease the gods, period. Symbolically, the victim of whom, is destroyed through the working of a hex or curse, which in turn leads to the physical, mental, or emotional destruction of the sacrifice, in ways and means not attributable to the magician. Please bear with me. So, the sacrifice is something the magician destroys in order to create a curse which goes to the victim. Alright, so this particular satanic ritual isn't just a manner of worship, but it's specifically the practical aspect of cursing somebody. Alright. The only time a Satanist would perform a human sacrifice would be if it were to serve a twofold purpose, that being to release the magician's wrath in the throwing of a curse, and more important, to dispose of a totally obnoxious and deserving individual. Under no circumstances would a Satanist sacrifice any animal or baby. For centuries, propagandists of the right-hand path have been prattling over the supposed sacrifice of small children and voluptuous maidens at the hand of diabolists. It would be thought that anyone reading or hearing of these heinous accounts would immediately question their authenticity, taking into consideration the biased sources of the stories. On the contrary, as with all holy lies which are accepted without reservation, this assumed modus operandi of the Satanist persists to this day. A dear friend of mine, before we ever encountered each other in person, we saw each other on a dating app. I swiped yes, she swiped no, and she was talking about sacrificing in the woods. And I was so excited for that. Delicious. Not as good as real ice cream, but I have low standards. And I'm hungry, and we remodeled the kitchen, and I don't want to be in there right now. Kudos to Ben and Jerry's for inventing, well, not inventing, for putting out their own line of vegan ice creams, trying to move away from that. I live in Rhode Island, and we have what is called Wright's Dairy Farm, and it upsets me so much. They've just started their own, we milk our own cows, we make our own ice cream, the Wright Scoop, Wright's Dairy Farm initiative, and I don't approve of that at all. I mean, how can anyone in good conscience, how messed up does someone have to be in their head? I know, funny coming from me, but please judge my argument in its own merits apart from myself. Something that I talked about in this ongoing identity crisis is the fact that our ideas are not born from us. Like, they spread and they germinate in our minds independently, and whether you get your idea from somebody else telling you about something directly or from the world, it's not yours. It exists as its own entity, but at the same time, it's an entity that exists on its own within the chemical makeup of your mind. I mean, unless you're talking about concepts, and I don't want to get into all that right now. Regardless, a crazy person can criticize another crazy person for being crazy. And in this case, what goes into maintaining a dairy cow and what happens when a dairy cow retires, it's awful and cruel. And who knows? Perhaps this person, despite growing up on a dairy farm, can realize the awful thing that herself and her forefathers have been doing for generations. Hunger is the best spice. There are sound and logical reasons why the Satanist could not perform such sacrifices. Man, the animal, is the Godhead to the Satanist. The purest form of carnal existence reposes in the bodies of animals and human children who have not grown old enough to deny themselves their natural desires. They can perceive things that the average adult human can never hope to. Therefore, the Satanist holds these beings in a sacred regard, knowing that he can learn much from these natural magicians of the world. This is true. There are different types of intelligence, different levels of awareness that are not necessarily greater or lesser than, but having more awareness is better, which means cooperating with people with different mindsets and outlooks. Oh, wonderful. I started with 2 cups of tea, and I'm down to a few sips. The Satanist is aware of the universal custom of the treader of the path of Agartha, the killing of the god. Inasmuch as gods are always created in man's own image, and the average man hates what he sees in himself, the inevitable must occur, the sacrifice of the god who represents himself. The Satanist does not hate himself, nor the gods he might choose, and has no desire to destroy himself or anything for which he stands. It is for this reason he could never willfully harm an animal or child. I'm going to have to write that down. Path of Agartha. I mean, that sounds vaguely Hindi, but that's nothing to go off of. Path of Agartha. Perhaps it's something that Dr. LeVay mentioned several passage chapters earlier, and I've forgotten in the many weeks since. The question arises, Who, then, would be considered a fit and proper human sacrifice, and how is one qualified to pass judgment on such a person? The answer is brutally simple. Anyone who has unjustly wronged you, one who has gone out of his way to hurt you, to deliberately cause trouble and hardship for you, or those dear to you. In short, a person asking to be cursed by their very actions. When a person, by his reprehensible behavior, practically cries out to be destroyed, it is truly your moral obligation to indulge them in their wish. The person who takes every opportunity to pick on others is often mistakenly called a sadistic, or not a sadistic. In reality, this person is a misdirected masochist who is working towards his own destruction. The reason a person viciously strikes out against you is because they are afraid of you or what you represent, or are resentful of your happiness. They are weak, insecure, and on extremely shaky ground when you throw your curse, and they make ideal human sacrifices. For whatever reason it is that one attempts to hurt the other, they aren't necessarily hurting themselves, even if they get away with it throughout their whole life, just because of the fact that they are the other person. And by creating that distinction, or I should say, by allowing for that distinction in their minds, they are lessening themselves, and also separating themselves more from the joy of loving all man. So we have no need to sacrifice them to ourselves. Well, you know what? That's an idea worth exploring. I'm not saying to hurt other people for your own gain. I mean in terms of giving up aspects of yourself for the sake of yourself. I mean, that was the whole idea behind the death and resurrection of Christ and various other figures, such as Zagreus, across mystic traditions everywhere. And yes, I am calling Christianity a mystic tradition. The whole idea that every single moment is death. I mean, that's kind of my thing. I've got all the skulls for it. And that to proceed forward in life, the present self must die. The person who had that experience with God, sitting a few feet from the person who I loved very much, that person still loves that other person very much, but that person is dead. She killed him, and I don't resent her for it. She's in a worse place right now. She's given into a lot of weakness in her heart, and I wish her well. But also, I don't love her anymore, because my love was killed. That's another thing, though, back to my whole identity crisis. If my love exists separate from me, but that determines my actions, if a person's qualities determine their actions, but their qualities aren't 100% baked into them. I mean, everybody has their own physiological, neurological framework that only so much can pass. All that aside, what makes a person their own person? I mean, that idea has this entire time what's been flying in the face of all of Dr. LaVey's work, but at the same time, we need to maintain the duality between being everyone and being the one and being no one. So I guess a trinity, whatever you want to call it. But everyone and no one are one. And one is also everyone, which is one, so it's also one. Not getting into that. But regardless, we need to maintain that mindset in order to flourish. I mean, if we only recognize one of those, then we're going to have some form of misery, whether that's peace without happiness, or love without respect, I should suppose esteem is the word for it. I went through various different phrases for it, but esteem is the right one. Esteem for the self, esteem for the other, can only be attained by acting in the world. You need to have something that is singular on yourself. Relying solely on esteem and happiness, that will never work. Those are mountains that could never be climbed. That's the Sisyphean task. And we need to be able to smile while pushing that boulder, as Camus often said. Well, I shouldn't say that. As Camus famously said. There we go. But if we only have those two things, then we're going to be miserable. We need to recognize the underlying peace and be okay with the fact that there never will be enough and our task never will be complete. And that's very hard to do when you look at the reality of all of us being one. A common phrase, like the whole translation of Buddha, enlightened, it's being able to see, it's being awoken. It's recognizing that your perspective as yourself is just your perspective as a part of the whole. It's a dream, and you're waking up from the dream. But dreams are real. Ideas are real. There is, even if they are mathematically, practically speaking, identical, there is a difference between 1 and 0.99 repeating. And that isn't a yes, it's a philosophical discussion rather than a mathematical one, although mathematics is just applied philosophy, so what are you gonna do? All right. And that all started with human sacrifice, and that's something that I'm going to have to think about long and hard off camera, because it will not be entertaining to watch me pick all of this apart in front of you. Usually, in order to get my ideas in order, I need to actually make a graph on paper and do the whole Pepe Sylvia shebang, but with abstract concepts. All right. Oh yeah, and just people who act like that are either actively harming themselves, whether they know it or not, or they are drawing misery to themselves. And like I said, my former friend, who I love very much, we weren't dating, but she is in a bad place right now. And a matter of fact, I could not be her friend again. She threatened the safety of myself and other people that I love. Though not romantically, but I would not be able to be her friend again unless she apologized. That's just something I'd have to be able to move forward. I can't accept her wholeheartedly anymore, knowing that she's given in so much to the darkness. Oh, I guess I shouldn't call it the darkness. An aberration of the darkness. Mad dogs are destroyed, and they need help far more than the human who conveniently froths at the mouth when irrational behavior is in order. It's easy to say, so what? These people are insecure, so they can't hurt me. But the fact remains that, given the opportunity, they would destroy you. Therefore, you have every right to, symbolically, destroy them. And if your curse provokes their actual annihilation, rejoice that you have been instrumental in ridding the world of a pest. If your success or happiness disturbs a person, you owe him nothing. He is made to be trampled underfoot. If people had to take the consequences of their own actions, they would think twice. But Mr. LeVay, if you crush someone who is trying to crush you, then you are crushing someone else, and then they have the right to crush you back, and it just keeps going forever, and it doesn't matter who starts it. And even if just the act of creating anything is an act of harm, you are changing the nature of a thing, you are killing it. And thankfully, this often doesn't have to do with livelihoods, but the wealth of the United States is built off of giving other countries, not always, but especially more in recent years with larger corporations, giving other countries bad deals and then making the difference in what consumers are willing to pay out of profit. And by purchasing into that, just the act of going to Walmart and buying a lawnmower or a bottle of bubble sauce, whatever you want to call it, you are hurting someone. You are perpetuating harm. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism. In another sense, though, the act of you breathing, the very act of breathing, is removing oxygen from the air that your future self, that your kin, would be able to use. And the same goes for plants when they take the same. Plants remove green light from the atmosphere. No, they don't remove green light. They remove blue light from the atmosphere. They're green because they reflect green light into our eyeballs. All right. Also, the time has come for me to put on the light. I'm not using candles because I want my makeup to not run. So, Mr. LeVay, no, that kind of philosophy that says it's okay to attack people at such and such a time and to wish for their harm, I don't approve. The act of consumption should always be with reverence and respect to the individual that it was taken from. And if you can appreciate the sacrifice that anyone that you take from has made to you, willingly or not, then that's going to allow you to exist better. And this starts as nothing more than a mindset, but mindsets are what create actions. And the actions of many, of course, are what create change. One more bite, and I gotta put this back in the refrigerator. One more bite. I will be back in 4 shakes of a lamb's tail. I do want to reupholster this thing. Needs to be washed as well. I picked it up off the roadside just the day before I made my last recording. Very itchy. From a distance you can't tell. All right. But I also really like recording from this particular seat. Very cozy. Oh yeah, And this also feeds into the whole ethics and consequentialism versus, I don't even know the name of the, I wouldn't say opposing, but one of the alternate philosophical ways of acting, but it's important. Life after death through the fulfillment of the ego. This is the next chapter. Man is aware that he will die someday. Other animals, when nearing death, know that they are about to die, but it is not until death is certain that the animal senses his coming departure from this world. And even then he does not know exactly what is entailed in dying. It is often pointed out that animals accept death gracefully, without fear or resistance. This is a beautiful concept, but only holds true in cases where death for the animal is unavoidable. That's true. When an animal is sick or injured, he will fight for his life with every ounce of strength he has left. And actually, no. I can think of several instances where an animal is just confused and afraid when they're dying. Usually it's just they're too weak to really act on those feelings. Sick or injured, he will fight for his life with every ounce of strength he has left. It is this unshakable will to live that, if man were not so highly evolved, would also give him the fighting spirit he needs to stay alive. It is a well-known fact that many people die simply because they give up and just don't care anymore. This is understandable if the person is very ill with no apparent chance for recovery, but this is not often the case. Man has become lazy. He has learned to take the easy way out. Even suicide has become less repugnant to many people than any number of other sins. Religion is totally to blame for this. I'm very interested to hear what Dr. LeVay has to say. You know, this wasn't planned, but let's say that this removal of makeup is symbolic of something or other. The best symbolism isn't planned. I was actually talking to somebody recently, and their perspective, which in some senses I agree with, is that we are things that act on impulses that are in one way or another outside of our own design. In the same way, the universe is a machine. No. The universe is a machine. I was just listening to that song yesterday, I can't remember. But anyway, about how, in that sense, if you can interpret or discover a will in the world at large, that would, in that case, make the things created by the universe or God art. And from a certain vantage point, I can see that as being true. Death, in most religions, is touted as a great spiritual awakening, one which is prepared for throughout life. This concept is very appealing to one who has not had a satisfactory life, but to those who have experienced all the joys life has to offer, there is a great dread attached to dying. This is as it should be. It is this lust for life which will allow the vital person to live on after the inevitable death of his fleshly shell. No, if you haven't had a satisfactory life, then you want to stick around until you can finally get what you came here for. As somebody who's confronted death many times, I can tell you this. And, you know, same thing when it comes to having good things. In fact, in that case, it's not just about not being able to have something in the future, it's about losing what you have right now. To a lesser extent, someone in a bad situation would have that. It's not like people who kill themselves, it's not like there's nothing left in their lives for them to attach joy to. It's that miseries or potential things that they dislike make all of the other positive things not worth it. It's a cost-benefit analysis. And I personally believe that there is, what's it called? No cost too great. History shows that men who have given their own lives in pursuit of an ideal have been deified for their martyrdom. Religionists and political leaders have been very crafty in laying their plans. By holding the martyr up as a shining example to his fellow men, they eliminate the common reaction that the willful self-destruction goes against all animal logic. Now that's why it's admirable. To the Satanist, martyrdom and non-personalized heroism is to be associated not with integrity, but with stupidity. This, of course, does not apply in situations which involve the safety of a loved one. Exactly. But to give one's own life for something as impersonal as a political or religious issue is the ultimate in masochism. Dr. LeVay, you've never loved someone you haven't met? That's just such a misogynistic thing to say. No. Misanthropic thing to say. Although it's misogynist too, since women are part of anthropy. Life is the one great indulgence, death the one great abstinence. I agree. To a person who is satisfied with his earthly existence, life is like a party, and no one likes to leave a good party. By the same token, if a person is enjoying himself here on earth, he will not so readily give up this life for the promise of an afterlife about which he knows nothing. The Eastern mystical beliefs teach humans to discipline themselves against any conscious will for success so they might dissolve themselves into universal cosmic awareness. Anything to avoid good, healthy self-satisfaction or honest pride in earthly accomplishments. It's interesting to note that the areas in which this type of belief flourishes are those where material gains are not easily obtainable. For this reason, the predominant religious belief must be one which commends its followers for their rejection of material things and their avoidance of the use of labels which attach a certain amount of importance to material gains. In this way, the people can be pacified into accepting their lot, no matter how small it may be. Satanism uses many labels. If it were not for the names, very few of us would understand anything in life, much less attach any significance to it. And significance compels recognition, which is something everyone wants, especially the Eastern mystic who tries to prove to everyone how he can meditate longer or stand more deprivation and pain than the next fellow. I don't know what kind of Eastern mystics this person is associated with, but much of the time people live as part of a collective, and this goes for monks in the Western tradition too. A big part of every single religion is the loss of your own name and a new name and identity, this giving up of yourself to have a rebirth. The Eastern philosophies preach the dissolution of man's ego before he can produce sins. It is unfathomable to the Satanist to conceive of an ego which would willfully choose denial of itself. In countries where this is used as a sop for the willingly impoverished, it is understandable that a philosophy which teaches the denial of the ego would serve a useful purpose, at least for those in power, to whom it would be detrimental if their people were discontented. But for anyone who has every opportunity for material gain, to choose this form of religious thought seems foolish indeed. It is through love for each other and not actively participating in the rat race, or only far in so much as to actually make a change, that's how we're going to be able to free people. The Eastern mystic believes strongly in reincarnation. To a person who has virtually nothing in this life, the possibility that he may have been a king in a past life, or may be one in the next life, is very attractive, and does much to appease his need for self-respect. If there is nothing in which they can take pride in this life, they can console themselves by thinking, there are always future lives. It never occurs to the believer in reincarnation that if his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, etc., had developed good karmas by their adherence to the same beliefs and ethics as his present ones, then why is he now living in privation rather than like a Maharaja? Well, the answer, of course, is because of just the vast amount of life and the number of roles that need to be filled. It's competitive. And also, you've got to take into account all of the different heavens and hells associated with Eastern traditions, or other planes. Calling them heavens or hells paints a very specific picture, which isn't entirely accurate. Belief in reincarnation provides a beautiful fantasy world in which a person can find the proper avenue of ego expression, but at the same time claim to have dissolved his ego. This is emphasized by the roles people choose for themselves in their past or future lives. That's another thing. Depending on who you talk to, reincarnation is not determined by an outside force, but rather it is the way that your soul is naturally drawn by understanding guilt or the underlying desires that propel you forward in life. And I have to agree with that model, not only on the spiritual but on the practical sense that the universe is a machine. I got that completely wrong. But we are every single king and every single pauper and every single robber and murderer and rapist and philosopher and artist and tech mogul and app developer and stockbroker and all the rest. Right now, we are. Because there is no difference between us. There's also no difference between the living and the dead in that respect. We are all one. And in that regard, we are all nothing. And in this sense, is that the destruction of the ego? No. The ego is a mechanical function of the mind, and weakening it can allow you to have more awareness, but it's just necessary to live, to function as an individual who is many, who is one, who is nothing, who is one. Believers in reincarnation do not always choose an honorable character. If the person is of a highly respectable and conservative nature, he will often choose a colorful rogue or gangster, thereby fulfilling his alter ego. Or a woman who has much social status may pick a harlot or famous courtesan for the characterization of herself in a past life. Funny, he thinks that they're choosing these things. If people were able to divorce themselves from the stigma attached to personal ego fulfillment, they would not need to play such self-deceitful games such as belief in reincarnation as a means of satisfying their natural need for ego fulfillment. The Satanist believes in complete gratification of his ego. Satanism, in fact, is the only religion which advocates the intensification or encouragement of the ego. Only if a person's own ego is sufficiently fulfilled can he afford to be kind and complimentary to others without robbing himself of his self-respect. We generally think of a braggart as a person with a large ego. In reality, his bragging results from a need to satisfy his impoverished ego. I should probably clarify here. An ego, I guess a way to put it is, there is the lens through which we look at the mind, and an ego is like the hand that holds the lens, if you catch my drift. It's not that... It's like self-awareness, it's self-perception, sentience. That which has sentience is that which has an ego. although even then, I guess a lot of people, when they say the death of the ego, it's more that the ego becomes detached from the self. And the awareness of thoughts being separate from the feeling of the thoughts. That's something else that I'm going to have to think very hard about later, but let's see, what is it that he said that really got my mind a-turning? Having a strong ego would be having a strong self-identity, while having a weaker ego would mean having a weaker self-identity. And that can manifest in a variety of ways. And that comes down to the person's own ideals. You can have a strong ego. I am me and I am great, therefore I have the right to look down on you. Or, am I me? Am I right? I have to test this out by putting someone down. Same outcome, two very, very different rationales. It's the whole thing about, for example, toxic masculinity. I'm a real man. I have a beard. I work out in the yard. I have a truck. I remodeled a kitchen. But if you have to rely on these outward signs of conventional masculinity, then what does that say about how comfortable you are in your own skin? That's something that I tell my friends every once in a while. I am comfortable not only as a man, but I'm comfortable as myself. And I'm comfortable with admitting that I'd like to be better at using eyeshadow. I mean, this is smudged, but seriously, look at what went on at the top. I don't know how it sunk into my eyes like that. I haven't been choosing the thumbnails. It's just been coincidental that they all happen to be rather good. I pray that, ooh, isn't the thumbnail. I want to keep this up till the very end, having nice thumbnails. I climb up the stalk and plant the bean. The universe is a machine. That's how it starts. If a person has been vital throughout his life and has fought to the end for his earthly existence, it is his ego which will refuse to die, even after the expiration of the flesh which housed it. Young children are to be admired for their driving enthusiasm for life. This is exemplified by the small child who refuses to go to bed when there is something exciting going on, and when once put to bed, will sneak down the stairs to peek through the curtain and watch. It is this childlike vitality which will allow the Satanist to peek through the curtain of darkness and death and remain earthbound. Or to apply your ego outside of yourself, to, instead of holding the lens, peeking through the curtain, to let go of that lens and move freely between all lenses, including the lens of the collective unconscious. Self-sacrifice is not encouraged by the Satanic religion. Therefore, unless death comes as an indulgence because of extreme circumstances, which make the termination of life a welcome relief from an unendurable earthly existence, suicide is frowned upon by the Satanic religion. Religious martyrs have taken their own lives, not because life was intolerable for them, but to use their supreme sacrifice as a tool to further the religious belief. We must assume, then, that suicide, if done for the sake of the Church, is condoned and even encouraged, even though their scriptures label it as a sin, because religious martyrs of the past have always been deified. It is rather curious that the only time suicide is considered sinful by other religions is when it comes as an indulgence. And I forget his particular rhetoric on like being overindulgent and not allowing for balance in a person's life. But I know that he's countered it already, so I won't go back and re-examine that. Well, I probably will, at the end of this whole book, want to understand, okay, but what if I just want to be lazy and eat vegan ice cream all day? Choosing not to do what our base desires tells us to do is the manner through which we die and are reborn as better people. Religious holidays. The highest of all holidays in the Satanic religion is the date of one's own birth. This is in direct contradiction to the holy of holy days of other religions, which deify a particular god who has been created in an anthropomorphic form of their own image, thereby showing that the ego is not really buried. But we are gods in our own image. The Satanist feels, why not really be honest? If you are going to create a god in your own image, why not create that god as yourself? Every man is a god if he chooses to recognize himself as one. I know that Mr. LaVey means Dr. LaVey means it in a very different way, but that's true. So, the Satanist celebrates his own birthday as the most important holiday of the year. After all, aren't you happier about the fact you were born than you are about the birth of someone you've never even met? Or for that matter, aside from religious holidays, why pay higher tribute to the birthday of a president or to a date in history than we do to the day that we were brought into this greatest of all worlds? Despite the fact that some of us may not have been wanted, or at least were not particularly planned, we're glad, even if no one else is, that we're here. You should give yourself a pat on the back, buy yourself whatever you want, treat yourself like the king or god that you are, and generally celebrate your birthday with as much pomp and ceremony as possible. Counter-argument. Live every single day as a celebration, because every day can be a celebration. It's a blessing that we are here to hold up the lens not only to the universe, but to ourselves. And I am thoroughly against having one day that's supposed to be your day, and then every other day is meh. No, every day is yours, and every day is mine, 100%. The way that I see birthdays is that it is other people's day to celebrate you. It's up to them to make the plans and all the rest. And different cultures view this differently. People have a saint's day, which I suppose makes things easier. That on your birthday, you're supposed to give to others, and then on your saint's day, that's when you and everyone else is celebrated. I think that works better for society as a whole, but if we make it so that every day is a celebration of life, as it should be, then that's an even better system. And then real acts of kindness and genuine appreciation that spawn from this mindset of, I love this person and I want to give them something, and I want to make this day special for them and for me, it comes all the more freely. Although I guess having that backup system of saints' days and birthdays works as well. I'd probably just reverse it though. Have the saints' day be the day of giving and the birthday the day of receiving. Oh, and something else I should say. Someone that I very much greatly look up to. Paul Hines. I've been very shy. Well, that's the understatement of the year. Very anxious and shy about talking to them. I hope that they're still alive. And he also had familiarity with the lives of clowns and whatnot. I've always aspired. No, that's not the right word. I've always been inspired and held deep respect for clowns. I mean, that's the tradition of bringing joy to people, more even than entertainment. But all that aside, they celebrate birthday and also the day of conception, and that makes it more of a family thing and makes the act of creating a new life, I mean, whether or not there's a soul at that point, I personally don't think there is, makes the act of creating a life even more beautiful. And what goes into making who you are goes so far back to the beginning of time itself and before. And I feel like it's more accurate to say that you are you when you're conceived. No, I take that back. You're more you when you have a conception of yourself, when you attain an ideology, which would probably be sometime after you've attained language. Not that, I will say, people look down on children for this, but you can absolutely have an ideology and a framework that the world works in before you've learned a language. It's all give and take things. We're splitting hairs about holidays of all things, which really, every day is a holy day, and the real specifics about how you celebrate it, it's small potatoes compared to just the general way that you view the universe and your soul. That comes out of that, in the same way that good thoughts produce good actions. Good thoughts produce good holidays, and I don't feel like arguing about the details of the right way to celebrate is important at this particular moment. Or at least I'm not interested in that as much. Despite the fact that some of us may not have been wanted, or at least were not particularly planned, we're glad, even if no one else is, that we're here. You should give yourself a pat on the back, etc., etc. After one's own birthday, the two major Satanic holidays are Walpurgisnacht and Halloween, or All Hallows Eve. Saint Walpurgis, or Walpurga, or Walburga, depending upon the time and area in which one is referring to her, was born in Sussex at the end of the 7th or the beginning of the 8th century, and was educated at Wimborne, Dorset, where, after taking the veil, she remained for 27 years. So she was a nun. I was forgetting the word for a female monk. I will say that I read a lot about this last night. Another name for the night of Walpurgis, Walpurgisnacht, night of Walpurgis, is Hexennacht, or the night of witches. And there's actually a specific mountain somewhere in one of the Russian satellite states, one of the Slovenia, I don't remember where. I'm not good with European geography. Always splitting apart and gluing back together again. There's a specific mountain that everybody stays away from because they're afraid of witch ritual, and I think that that's hilarious, and I'm totally going there one day. Alright. She then, at the insistence of her uncle, Saint Boniface, and her brother, Saint Willibald, set out along with some other nuns to found the religious houses in Germany. Her first settlement was at Bischofsheim in the Diocese of Mainz, and 2 years later, in 754 AD, she became the abbess of the Benedictine nunnery at Heidenheim, while within her brother Willibald's Diocese of Eichstätt in Bavaria, that's the place, where another brother, Weinbald, had at the same time also been made head of a monastery. And for future reference, AD, after death, is a Christian way of counting the years. These days, what is it that we use? I don't remember, but it's when the years started counting forward again. That's what AD means. Before Common Era, so Common Era would be CE. There we go. AD means CE. On the death of Weinbald in 1760, she succeeded him in his charge, retaining the superintendence of both houses until her death on February 25th, 779. Her relics were translated to Eichstätt, where she was laid out in a hollow rock, from which exuded a kind of bituminous oil, afterwards known as Walpurgis oil, regarding as having some miraculous efficacy against disease. The cave became a place of pilgrimage, and a great church was built over the spot. She is commemorated at various times, but principally on May 1st. Her day taking the place of an earlier pagan festival. May 1st is such a lovely day. It might not be the case in the United States at the moment, but that is the real workers' rights day, the real Labor Day, which was actually the result of an anarchist movement to create the 8-hour workday and stave away the 12-hour workday. Of course, in the United States, we've done a lot to push that back and even change the date, but May 1st is a beautiful day. Also, I have no idea what it means for something to be bituminous. Writing that down. And I'm also just curious, does Walpurgis oil still exist? Have people made salves with the same effects as Walpurgis oil? I'd have to travel to Walpurgis soil to find Walpurgis oil. It'll be wrapped in Walpurgis foil. Life is a celebration. Amazingly enough, all of this rigmarole was found necessary simply to condone the continuance of the most important pagan festival of the year, the grand climax of the spring equinox. Oh! I didn't know about that! The eve of May has been memorialized as the night that all of the demons, specters, afrits, and banshees would come forth and hold their wild revels, symbolizing the fruition of the spring equinox. Afrits. Never heard that term before. Actually, maybe I have. Halloween, All Hallows' Eve, or All Saints' Day, falls on October 31st or November 1st. Originally, All Hallows' Eve was one of the great fire festivals of Britain at the time of the Druids. In Scotland, it was associated with the time when the spirits of the dead, the demons, witches, and sorcerers were unusually active and propitious. Propitious? Never heard of that one before. Thank goodness there was no new vocabulary from the last chapter. The last two readings, I guess. Paradoxically, All Hallows' Eve was also the night when young people performed magical rituals to determine their future marriage partners. The youth of the villages carried on with much merrymaking and sensual revelry. But the older people took great care to safeguard their homes from the evil spirits, witches, and demons who had exceptional power that night. The solstices and equinoxes are also celebrated as holidays as they herald the first day of the seasons. The difference between a solstice and an equinox is a semantic one, defining the relationship between... It's not semantic. Well, unless he means semantic in a different term. Defining the relationship between the sun, the moon, and the fixed stars. The solstice applies to summer and winter, and the equinox refers to the autumn and spring. And it explicitly relates only to the sun, solas, sol, sun. Equinox, equal, of course, is that the day is the same length as the night, and I don't pay much attention to where that is, while the solstices, like interstice, it's like the middle part. Actually, no, I don't know how to break that word down etymologically, but it's the darkest day, or lightest day, before things start going up again. And the fact that Halloween, or a day around that time, because of course we only have 365 or 366 days in a calendar year, that 0.25, it always varies back and forth. And even then, after 40 years, 40 or like 30 years, we need to add an extra day. Yeah, there's no set up and down for when the equinox is going to be. Anyway, the summer solstice is in June, and the winter solstice is in December. The autumn equinox is in September, and the spring equinox is in March. Both the equinoxes and the solstices vary a day or two from year to year. depending on the lunar cycle at the time, but usually fall on the 21st or 22nd of the month. 5 to 6 weeks after these days, the legendary Satanic revels are celebrated. Halloween is my favorite holiday, if you could have guessed, and so I'm very excited to see what kind of new traditions I can incorporate into my celebration of Halloween. This year I'm going to be dressing up as a gender-bent, what's it called? Inanna. Not Ereshkigal, Ishtar. One of the demons that he said was worthy of worship early in the book, and one of the chief deities of a particular Babylonian time period. She usurped Anu as the godhead. You can tell Anunnaki means the son of the son of the sky and the earth, and so all of the gods would be referred to as the Anunnaki as a group, and Inanna would be the the child of the moon, which I think is just Ina. Yeah. So somehow she's the child of the moon, but she is the godhead, and she became more of a thing of dying and being reborn, which I guess is symbolically relevant to the moon in the way that it disappears and comes back again, the lunar cycle. But also, she's like the stars are what she's representative of. Her sister, who's in the underworld all of the time, Ereshkigal, she's the moon goddess. I know that there are many different translations for her descent into the underworld. All of them involve that she has to have 7 holy raiments. And depending on the translation, they always say the 7 holy raiments are safeguards, but it's more or less than 7, usually more. The joke is, in ancient Babylonia, they couldn't count to 7 right. But one translation about what she wears over her chest is the lunar breastplate. So that's just interesting, that she is the star god, but she's got the lunar breastplate, that she's the son of the moon, or child of the moon, pardon me. She also wears the makeup that's called Let a Man Come, Let Him Come, and the boris that's called Let a Man Come, Let a Man Come, or something like that. It's hilarious. The Black Mass. No other single device has been associated with Satanism as much as the Black Mass. To say that the most blasphemous of all religious ceremonies is nothing more than a literary invention is certainly a statement which needs qualifying, but nothing could be truer. The popular concept of the Black Mass is thus: a defrocked priest stands before an altar consisting of a nude woman, her legs spread eagled and vagina thrust open, each of her outstretched fists grasping a black candle made from the fat of unbaptized babies, and a chalice containing the urine of a prostitute, or blood, reposing on her belly. An inverted cross hangs above the altar, and triangular hosts of ergot-laden bread or black-stained turnip are methodically placed as the priest dutifully slips them in and out of the altar lady's labia. Ooh. Then, we are told, an invocation to Satan and various demons is followed by an array of prayers and psalms chanted backwards or interspersed with obscenities, all performed within the confines of a protective pentagram drawn on the floor. If the devil appears, he is invariably in the form of a rather eager man wearing the head of a black goat upon his shoulders. Then follows a potpourri of flagellation, prayer book burning, cunnilingus, fellatio, and general hindquarters kissing, all done to a background of ribald recitations from the Holy Bible and audible expectorations on the cross. If a baby can be slaughtered during the ritual, so much the better, for as everyone knows, this is the favorite sport of the Satanist. I feel like I've got to get my gold chalice out right now. Got nothing to put in it.
Guess it can fill it with hot water.
Whoa! Bottoms up? Delightful. If this sounds repugnant, then the success of the reports of the Black Mass, in keeping with the devout in the Church, is easy to understand. No decent person could fail to side with the inquisitors when told of these blasphemies. The propagandists of the Church did their job well, informing the public at one time or another of the heresies and heinous acts of the pagans, or another of the heresies and heinous acts the pagans, the Cathars, the Bogomils, Templars, and others who, because of their dualistic philosophies and sometimes satanic logic, had to be eradicated. Fun thing, the Cathars and the Templars in particular are Christian sects, but I guess he's referring to Satanism explicitly as branching off from the Abrahamic mindset. So I guess all Satanists in that regard are also Christians. Not these guys, though. I mean, they're looking at things from an atheistic, just anti-religionist worldview, yet somehow also creating a religion. I look forward to seeing how he gets into that, because so far, all that Dr. LaVey has presented has been a philosophy and practice for a healthier life. I've never heard of the Bogomils. And when it comes to being satanic, the Cathars in particular were an ascetic sect that believed that to become closer to Christ and experience their suffering, they had to give up all of their worldly possessions, which Christ himself many times instructed people to do, and communally share amongst each other, having nothing. You know, it's easier for a wealthy person to go to, harder for a wealthy person to go to heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. All that. Catholicism is communist. All right. The stories of unbaptized babies being stolen by Satanists for use in the Mass were not only effective propaganda measures, but also provided a constant source of revenue for the Church in the form of baptism fees. No Christian mother would, upon hearing of these diabolical kidnappings, refrain from getting her child properly baptized post-haste. The baptism, which also relates to birth, the ba in there, but that's also something that would be more suitable as a birthday than the creation of your person, so to speak, than the day of conception or the day of birth. Because you aren't the person you were on those days. Today is more your birthday than on the day you were born, because you, as you are, were not born on that day. I'm introducing to you, at least if not to new ideas, to new experiences. And thus, I've killed you and made you anew. And I don't take that as a point of pride. Anything, had I not existed, although I necessarily must exist as a part of everything, would be killing you right now. I hope that's the thumbnail. Another fact of man's nature was apparent in the fact that the writer or artist with lewd thoughts could exercise his most obscene predilections in the portrayal of activities of heretics. The censor who views all pornography so that he will know what to warn others of is the modern equivalent of the medieval chronicler of the obscene deeds of the Satanists, and of course, their modern journalistic counterparts. It is believed that the most complete library of pornography in the world is owned by the Vatican. It's the intent behind something that makes something pornography or not. It's true that everything can and is erotic, but pornography is specifically created with the intention of being erotic. And you can take the... no, I'm not going to go down that road again about God creating everything, but influencing, imbibing in, moving things forward, Anyway, part of this fear is justified. Some of the more, no, some ways that people have in the past tried to become closer to everything in the oneness are necessarily harmful to the self. Like asceticism, you can learn to detach your ego through following extreme stripping of goods and self. But another way is through drug-induced madness or meditation-induced madness. It's the mad people who are the most sane. But all of that aside, particularly I was researching a bunch about Zagreus/Sabadios. What was his name again? Sabadio, the bronze hand of Sabadio. And their cults would literally tear people apart as ritualistically reliving the death and rebirth of their god at the hands of the Titans being torn apart and put back together again. The kissing of the devils behind during the traditional Black Mass is easily recognized as the forerunner of the modern term used to describe the one who will, through appealing to another's ego, gain materially from him. As all satanic ceremonies were performed toward very real or material gods, the oscularum infame, or kiss of shame, was considered to be a symbolic requisite towards earthly, rather than spiritual, success. The usual assumption is that the satanic ceremony or service is always called a Black Mass. A Black Mass is not the magical ceremony practiced by Satanists. The Satanist would only employ the use of a Black Mass as a form of psychodrama. Furthermore, a Black Mass does not necessarily imply that the performers of such are Satanists. A Black Mass is essentially a parody on religious service of the Roman Catholic Church, but can be loosely applied to a satire of any religious ceremony. To the Satanist, the Black Mass, in its blaspheming of the Orthodox rites, is nothing more than a redundancy. The services of all established religions are actually parodies of old rituals performed by the worshippers of the earth and the flesh. Not all old people. I'm not going there. In attempts to desexualize and dehumanize the pagan beliefs, later men of spiritual faith whitewashed the honest meanings behind the rituals into the bland euphemisms now considered to be the true Mass. Even if the Satanist were to spend each night performing a Black Mass, he would no more be performing a travesty than the devout churchgoer who unwittingly attends his own Black Mass, his spoof on the honest and emotionally sound rites of pagan antiquity. Mr. LaVey spends so much time in this book decrying modern practice and glorifying the old without a more nuanced perspective that the people in the past, they didn't have the things that we have now, but they were just as much the same kind of people going through the same day-to-day life struggles as we are now. They weren't fools. They weren't somehow more spiritually enlightened than we are by the grace of being who they are. Perhaps living outside of this very complex societal structure that we've built would allow somebody to pursue finding meaning in the universe more proactively. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to come to greater conclusions than what we have in the modern day, or different conclusions, especially considering we have information about what they did and what we're doing now, and more information about the actual scientific nature of the universe in terms of the start and its continued expansion, about particles, about dark matter, although we mostly call it dark matter because we don't know about it. It's dark in the sense we can't see it. Funny thing, science Science and seance come from the same root term of to see. Although these days it's getting harder and harder to, with the naked eye, observe the workings of the universe, particularly those searching for a spiritual element of existence, whether you want to call it aether or orgone. Some people, most people call it vibes or energy, but energy would be a movement. I guess you could say that since we're all one, that everything is necessarily just movement, separating and floating in and out, a big old solution of stuff that's one thing but contains multitudes. But at the same time, energy is the capacity to do work. And thus, I'm not even talking about my soul. This cup, and I guess animists would also agree with this, although I guess what I'm saying is inherent to animist belief. This cup is energy, and it's a dang heck of a lot of it. If we were to extract all of the energy that makes this cup and turn it into heat and light and electromagnetism and all the rest, it would be enough to burn the earth to a crisp, or at least a good portion of it. Water is delicious. I did quit tea for a time, just because I didn't want to rely too harshly on caffeine, and even then, I always have enjoyed hot water. That's actually a tradition in some places. I have this unfinished mug. I've sculpted it so that it can fit in my cup holder. This is the Japanese character for hot water, because it is common to just drink hot water without tea there. And the, is it 8-pointed star? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, the 8-pointed star holds significance to me in terms of humanity. I guess you could say that it's vaguely related to the Eightfold Path, but really that's not my intention. If you really want to know my intention, it's a reference to my favorite video game. But even then, my favorite video game is a lot of real-world, historical, philosophical, and it's about the origin of humanity as a species and the way that ideas have changed over the past. And the answer it comes to is ancient aliens, but it's fun. Just because there's that layer of fiction over the top of everything doesn't mean that you can't learn tangentially. Every single moment is a learning moment in the same way that every single moment is a celebration. Highly recommended if you like puzzles. La Mulana. You can't see, but I actually have 3 copies of this Hidden Treasures special edition. I only wanted 2, one to keep under wraps and this, but I'm glad that I got 3 because I was making the jigsaw puzzle that came with it with my grandmother, and she lost a piece, so I had to open up the second one. Also, it means that I can have the soundtrack CD that came with it in my car and in my house, and I don't need to bring it back and forth. Very convenient. Yeah, that's my 2 things. Addicted to video games, but I'm never giving up on La Mulana. I spend way too much time with anime, but I'm never giving up on Mob Psycho or Code Geass, which I mentioned before. Although I don't think that if there is this supposed 3rd season of Code Geass that I will continue. Zagreus, who I've mentioned several times, in popular culture is actually the main protagonist of the, at the time, latest game from Supergiant, and I'm sure that they're going to go on to do many other Supergiant things in the future. My favorite title of theirs, although I haven't actually played Hades, which stars Zagreus, yet, and I don't plan to, giving up on video games. Pyre is my favorite of the games that they've made, and I highly recommend it. It didn't get as wide a release of platforms as their other titles, and I feel like it will deserve a closer look for many years to come. Any ceremony considered a black mass must effectively shock and outrage, as this seems to be the measure of its success. In the Middle Ages, blaspheming the Holy Church was shocking. Now, however, the Church does not present the awesome image it did during the Inquisition. The traditional black mass is no longer the outrageous spectacle to the dilettante or renegade priest that it once was. If the Satanist wishes to create a ritual to blaspheme an accepted institution for the purpose of psychodrama, he is careful to choose one that is not in vogue to parody. Thus, he is truly stepping on a sacred cow. A black mass today would consist of blaspheming of such sacred topics as Eastern mysticism, psychiatry, the psychedelic movement, ultra-liberalism, etc. Patriotism would be championed, drugs and their gurus would be defiled, all cultural militants would be deified, and the decadence of the ecclesiastical theologies might even be given a satanic boost. The satanic magus has always been the catalyst for the dichotomy necessary in molding popular beliefs, and in this case, a ceremony in the nature of a black mass may serve a far-reaching magical purpose. Okay. In the year 1666, some rather interesting events occurred in France, with the death of Francois Mansart, the architect of the trapezoid, whose geometrics were to become the prototype of the haunted house. The Palace of Versailles was being constructed in accordance with his plans. The last of the glamorous priestesses of Satan, Jeanne-Marie Bouvier, Madame Guyon, was to be overshadowed by a shrewd opportunist and callous businesswoman named Catherine de Chaise, otherwise known as La Voisine. Here was an erstwhile beautician who, while dabbling in abortions and purveying the most efficient poisons to ladies desirous of eliminating unwanted husbands or lovers, found in the lurid accounts of Le Messe Noir a proverbial brainstorm. Messe Noir, I'm just going to assume, means black mass, but I'm actually interested in these historical figures. I am writing their names down. The works of Francois Mansart, pronounced with an English, American English, that would be Francoise Mansart. You can spell it out from that. And I do love trapezoids. They used to be my favorite shape before I fell in love with the hexagon. But even then, the hexagon is just 2 trapezoids. And trapezoid is 3 triangles, etc., etc. Jeanne-Marie Bouvier is... You can guess how her first name is spelled. It's the fancy French spelling with the N-N-E at the end of Jean. And Bouvier is B-O-U-V-I-E-R. Jean-Marie Bouvier. I should have just written down Madame Guyon. And I think I've heard of Catherine de Chaise before. La Voisine. I gotta remember what that means. I think it's just the vision. Pretty sure. My French is not on tip-top shape these days. It is safe to say that 1666 was the year of the first commercial black mass. In the region south of Saint Denis, which is now called La Garenne, a great walled house was purchased by La Voisine and fitted with dispensaries, cells, laboratories, and a chapel. Soon after, it became de rigueur for royalty and lesser dilettantes to attend and participate in the very type of service mentioned earlier in this chapter. The organized fraud perpetrated in these ceremonies has become indelibly marked in history as the true Black Mass. When La Voisine was arrested on March 13th, 1679, in the Church of Our Blessed Lady of Good Tidings, incidentally, the die had already been cast. The degraded activities of La Voisine had stifled the majesty of Satanism for many years to come. The Satanism for fun and games fad next appeared in England in the middle of the 18th century in the form of Sir Francis Dashwood's Order of the Medmenham Franciscans, popularly called the Hellfire Club. While eliminating the blood, gore, and baby-fat candles of the previous century's masses, Sir Francis managed to conduct rituals replete with good dirty fun, and it certainly provided a colorful and harmless form of psychodrama for many of the leading lights of the period. An interesting sideline of Sir Francis, which lends a clue to climate of the Hellfire Club, was a group called the Dilettanti Club, of which he was the founder. In the 19th century, that brought a whitewashing to Satanism and the feeble attempts of white magicians trying to perform black magic. It was the 19th century. This very paradoxical period for Satanism, with writers such as Baudelaire and Huysmans, who despite their apparent obsession with evil, seemed nice enough fellows. The devil developed his Luciferian personality for the public to see, and gradually evolved into a sort of drawing-room gentleman. It was this era of experts on the black arts, such as Eliphas Levi and countless other trance mediums who, with their carefully bound spirits and demons, have also succeeded in binding the minds of many who call themselves parapsychologists to this day. As far as Satanism was concerned, the closest outward signs of this were the neo-pagan rites conducted by MacGregor Mather's Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley's later Order of the Silver Star. Therefore, Argentinum Astrum. What's the name? The three dots that mean the transfer of energy. I know that they can be used to mean therefore. Mr. Crowley is a very interesting figure. I don't know too much about his later writings, but his first big outing and the one true commandment of do what thou will. It's true. And the Order of the Oriental Templars, OTO, which paranoically denied any association with Satanism, despite Crowley's self-imposed image of the Beast of Revelation. Aside from some rather charming poetry and a smattering of magical bric-a-brac, when not climbing mountains, Crowley spent most of his time as a poseur par excellence and worked overtime to be wicked. Like his contemporary, Reverend, Montague Summers, Crowley obviously spent a large part of his life with his tongue jammed firmly into his cheek, but his followers today are somehow able to read esoteric meaning into his every word. Perennially concurrent with these societies were the sex clubs using Satanism as a rationale that persists today, for which tabloid newspaper writers may give thanks. If it appears that the Black Mass developed from a literary invention of the Church to a depraved commercial actuality, to a psychodrama for dilettantes and iconoclasts, to an ace in the hole for popular media, then where does it fit into the true nature of Satanism, and who was practicing satanic magic in those years beyond 1666? Yeah, I feel like what he's saying here about seeking purity in the impure rather than a performance for performance sake, it has its merits. But also, I don't think that Crowley was trying to be a performer. I think that he did have real belief in his power as a magician. I know I certainly do. To what degree he was able to influence things magically, to what degree is a great or powerful magician defined, those are things that I've yet to discover, and I look forward to doing so. I haven't read too much about Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I think that Crowley was a part of that at one point. Same thing with the OTO, but I'm not particularly interested because, like he's saying, they're their pursuit of magic is a very particular take, which is in some ways very human, but it's not very humanist, if you understand what I'm trying to say. Everybody defines it different, but I define white magic as that which is consistent with the total will of the universal mind. And it's possible to conduct it without directly calling on the influence of the universal mind, but you can't really be sure unless you let it inhabit you. On the other hand, black magic I define as a singular or a collective working without the all for a specific purpose, and that can be for good, it can be for evil. A lot of people draw this distinction as selfish or not, but it's not always about love of the self. Well, technically it is always about love of the self, because whether or not you're acting in the totality of the will of the universal mind, the collective unconscious, or meta-universal entity, I might add, doesn't mean that you're acting outside of its influence. The answer to this riddle, as in where does stuff fit into the true nature of Satanism, lies in another. Is the person, generally considered to be a Satanist, really practicing Satanism in its true sense, rather from the point of view taken by the opinion makers of heavenly persuasion? Yeah, it's what you spent the last 2 pages describing. It has often been said, and rightly so, that all of the books about the devil have been written by the agents of God. It is therefore quite easy to understand how a certain breed of devil worshippers was created through the inventions of the theologians. This erstwhile evil character is not necessarily practicing true Satanism, nor is he a living embodiment of the element of the untrammeled pride or majesty of the self, which gave the post-pagan world of the churchman's definition of evil. The churchman's definition of evil. He is instead the byproduct of later and more elaborate propaganda. The pseudo-Satanist, I would just call them regular black magicians. The pseudo-Satanist has always managed to appear throughout modern history with his black masses of varying degrees of blasphemy, but the real Satanist is not so quite easily recognized as such. It would be an oversimplification to say that every successful man and woman on earth is, without knowing it, a practicing Satanist, but the thirst for earthly success and its ensuing realization are certainly grounds for St. Peter turning thumbs down. If the rich man's entry into heaven seems difficult as the camel's attempt to go through the eye of a needle, if the love of money is the root of all evil, then we must at least assume the most powerful men on earth to be the most satanic. This applies to financiers, industrialists, popes, poets, dictators, and all sorts of assorted opinion makers and field marshals of the world's activities. Occasionally, through the leakages, one of the enigmatic men or women of earth will be found to have dabbled in the black arts. These, of course, are brought to light as the mystery men of history. Names like Rasputin, Zaharoff, Cagliostro, and Rosenberg and their ilk are links, clues, so to speak, of the true legacy of Satan. A legacy which transcends ethnic, racial, and economic differences and temporal ideologies as well. The Satanist has always ruled the earth, and always will, by whatever the name is called, Demiurgus, for example. One thing stands sure. The standards, philosophy, and practices set forth on these pages are those employed by the most self-realized and powerful humans on earth. In the secret thoughts of each man and woman, still motivated by sound and unclouded minds, resides the potential of the Satanist, as always has been. The sign of the horns shall appear to many now, rather than the few, and the magician will stand forth that he may be recognized. Absolutely. He makes this whole book as the idea of the one standing against the many, and it is intrinsic to ourselves that we are the one. Is that just another... I see. Oh, it finally makes sense. This kind of, I'm going to have to do some deeper thinking about this, solves the existential crisis I've been having. It's because the ego is not the self. The self is the lens. And that seems so... And the lens does not own the qualities, but is characterized by the unchanging, harder to change. I understand now. This completely makes sense. You can use your ego to hold other lenses, but you cannot separate your bodily presence from the lens that you have been born and will continue to be shaped throughout your life. Like, glasses can get smudges and scratches, but they are, at the end of the day, or are they? They are the descendant of what has hit, what has bounced off the glasses, but they are remaining the same glasses. You get my point. I'm trying to think here. Yeah, that's how you define it. Like, what is one and what is another is about how you define it. In the sense that these glasses are dead, that the dust that has settled on them in the past few seconds has killed them, remains true. But as you define yourself as the lens through which you look, then that is from where you can draw your identity. And it doesn't matter if your identity has died over and over again, and that your identity is... that your lenses can be influenced by other lenses. It's still your lenses. This is an idea that's new to me, and I'm not putting it into words correctly. And even now, by expressing it, I keep bumping into issues. This is something I have to work on my own, but I'm going to have to... You are your lens. You are your experience. That is uniquely your own. Even if the totality of experience overall you are part of, and it is not yours, it is the one, your particular experience contributing to the greater experience is your own, which seems commonsensical. I don't know why I wasn't able to grasp that before. I suppose it's because I'm a fool. And that was the end of that chapter. And there we go. The next book, the Book of Earth, the Book of Belial. And I guess we're sticking to this 2-hour time frame. You know, I think that I'm going to have a tea break, and now that my makeup's off, I can light some candles, and I think I'm going to jump right in. I just want to go a little bit further back here. And he says, the emergence of Lucifer. I think it was in the title of this chapter. He also gave a very specific definition of who Lucifer is. I mean, this whole section that we've been doing the last 4 or 5 parts about has been all the Book of Lucifer. You know what? I'll get back to you on that in the next part. Peace and love. Got those backwards. And benediction.